December 2015. Inside FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., a senior official performs a ritual that has happened only 7 times in 65 years. He stands before the famous wall, the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives, and removes a photograph. No arrest, no shootout, no body found, just a quiet deletion. The same agency that hunted Osama bin Laden across the mountains of Afghanistan, that dismantled New York's 5 families, that tracked terrorists and spies across every continent, is surrendering. Not to a bullet, not to a prison cell, to bureaucracy. The memo lands with clinical calm. It reads, "Subject resides in a country with no U.S. extradition treaty." The translation, whispered in hallways and briefing rooms, is far simpler: "We cannot get him." And here is what makes this moment truly unsettling. He is not hiding in a cave. He is not buried in a jungle. He is sipping champagne in a Moscow suburb protected by Vladimir Putin himself. For years, the FBI built a 45-count indictment. They exposed a fake billion-dollar magnet company. They tracked shell companies from Budapest to Vienna to Cyprus to the Cayman Islands. Years of work. Witnesses who risked their lives. None of it mattered. The white whale swims free. What kind of man makes the FBI surrender? How does a stocky Ukrainian con artist with thick glasses become untouchable to the most powerful nation on earth? To understand that, we must go back. Back to a quiet street in Pennsylvania. Back to a factory that never made anything. Back to where the American nightmare began. May 13, 1998. Newtown, Pennsylvania. A quiet suburban town where nothing ever happens. At dawn, 47 FBI agents in full tactical gear surround an unremarkable industrial building. It sits on a peaceful street, surrounded by trees and strip malls. The sign outside reads, "YBM Magnex International." To the world, YBM is a Wall Street fairy tale. On paper, this company is a miracle. A publicly traded magnet manufacturer valued at nearly $1 billion on the Toronto Stock Exchange. The stock has climbed 300% in 2 years. Pension funds in Canada bought in. Day traders in New York chased the momentum. Teachers in Ohio. Firefighters in Chicago. Retirees in Florida. Ordinary Americans flooded their savings into this wonder stock, believing they had found a golden ticket. The company's world headquarters sits right here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and the FBI has spent 26 months building a case to tear it apart. A command crackles over the radio. Flashbangs detonate with deafening explosions. Agents breach the doors and sweep through offices with weapons raised. They expect chaos. They expect to find a bustling manufacturing floor, executives scrambling to shred documents, workers running. Instead, they find silence. The warehouse is cavernous, empty, dead. Industrial machinery sits under flickering fluorescent lights, gleaming and expensive but motionless. An assembly line that has never assembled anything. Conveyor belts that have never moved. The machines are props. Staged. Decorations for investor tour. Agents walk through rows of finished products lining the shelves. They pick up boxes labeled as high-grade industrial magnets. Inside, they find dummy samples, magnets purchased from legitimate suppliers and repackaged with YBM labels. The emperor has no clothes. YBM Magnex International is not making anything at all. Documents cover every surface. Purchase orders, invoices, technical drawings, mountains of paperwork that look perfectly legitimate. It is all theater, an elaborate stage play designed to fool Wall Street. By the time trading is halted, the scam has vaporized more than $150 million of investor money, one of the largest financial crimes in North American history. But as agents sift through the debris, they realize something. This was not just a fraud. This was a masterpiece of deception, and the man behind it was nowhere to be found. FBI forensic accountants begin the painstaking work of picking apart the fraud. They trace money cycling through bank accounts from Budapest to Vienna to the Caribbean. Millions reported as magnet sales that never occurred. Invoices paid for products that never shipped. Revenue declared for business that never happened. If this was a simple pump and dump scheme, who was the mastermind? Who cashed out $150 million and left behind an empty factory as a calling card? Agents trace the web of shell companies. Layer after layer of corporate obfuscation, designed specifically to hide one name. But eventually, they find it. a signature on a shell company document, a name on a bank authorization form, a ghost materializing from the paperwork. Semyon Mogilevich, Ukrainian-born, 51 years old, economics degree from Lviv University. A ghost with no U.S. presence, no American footprint, no trace in any domestic database. On the surface, he appears to be a white-collar con artist, a rogue financier, a clever fraudster who found a way to fleece Americans from abroad. But as they dig deeper, a chilling realization crystallizes. This man is far more than a clever fraudster. He is what organized crime experts coldly call a global player. Put less gently, he is the boss of bosses of the Russian Mafia. A criminal whose reach extends across continents, whose operations make the American mob look like street gangs, whose power rivals small nations. The FBI's routine fraud case just exploded into something much bigger. But why would a crime lord running weapons, drugs, and trafficking operations bother with a magnet company in suburban Pennsylvania? What was a man of his stature doing targeting American retirees and pension funds? A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania indicts Semyon Mogilevich on 45 counts: racketeering, conspiracy, securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering. Prosecutors assemble a dossier spanning thousands of pages. Witnesses who risked their lives to testify. Paper trails tracing millions through banks across Europe and the Caribbean. By 2003, they have assembled what should be an airtight case. Everything needed to put Mogilevich away for the rest of his natural life. Everything except Semyon Mogilevich himself. In all his years of masterminding this massive fraud, Mogilevich never set foot on American soil. Not once. Every fax from YBM's Pennsylvania office routed through Budapest. Every phone call with executives was placed from Hungary or Russia. Every wire transfer was orchestrated from abroad. He was like a phantom conductor, directing an orchestra he never joined. The Bureau has a 45-count indictment with his name on it, but they cannot slap handcuffs on a ghost who exists only as a signature on shell company documents. To prosecute him in a U.S. court, they need to physically get him into the United States. Extradition becomes their only hope. And that hope, as the FBI is about to learn, is fading by the minute. Special Agent Mike Dixon, sitting in the FBI's Philadelphia office, begins to grasp the true shadow they are chasing. Years later, he would describe the realization. He's a big man, he's a very powerful man, I think more powerful than a John Gotti could be because he has the ability to influence nations. John Gotti, the Teflon Don, ran New York. He could bribe judges, he could sway a borough, he could order hits from a social club in Queens. But Mogilevich could pull levers that affected entire countries. Gotti never reached that stature. He was a local celebrity. Mogilevich was a global force. The agents thought they had caught a formidable fraudster. Instead, they have uncovered a shadow boss of international crime, operating oceans away, beyond their reach. How do you catch a man who lives in a world without borders? And what made a crime lord whose empire spans continents decide to target American retirees' pension funds? To answer that, we must go back further. Back to the Soviet Union. Back to the beginning. Lviv, Ukraine. The 1970s. The Soviet Union is decaying, rotting from within, though few realize it yet. In this provincial city, a young man named Semyon Mogilevich is studying economics at the local university. He is not imposing, stocky, thick glasses, a face that blends into crowds. But his mind is different. He has a gift for numbers, for patterns, for understanding how money moves. And he has no conscience to get in the way. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s, Jewish families faced impossible choices. Anti-Semitism was government policy. Opportunities were limited. Many wanted to leave to Israel, to America, to anywhere else. But the Soviet government had rules. Before you could emigrate, you had to liquidate all your assets. Sell your apartment, your furniture, your heirlooms, your life. These families were desperate. They needed someone to help them convert their Soviet lives into cash they could take abroad. They needed someone they could trust. Enter young Semyon Mogilevich. He approached these families with a gentle smile and a reassuring manner. He offered to help. He would sell their apartments for fair market value. He would find buyers for their furniture. He would appraise their heirlooms. He would wire them the proceeds once they arrived in Vienna or Tel Aviv or New York. They trusted him. They handed him keys, deeds, their grandmother's jewelry, their life savings. Mogilevich pocketed everything. When those families arrived in Vienna with nothing but the clothes on their backs, they waited for the wire transfers that never came. They called numbers that no longer worked. They wrote letters that went unanswered. They had no recourse. They were in foreign countries with no money, no contacts, no way to fight back. Some of those families eventually settled in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. They formed the nucleus of what would become New York's Russian mob. They remembered the name Mogilevich. Some would work for him later. Some would fear him forever. He served 2 short prison stints in the Soviet Union for fraud and currency speculation. Prison did not reform him, it educated him. He emerged each time with money hidden away, with underworld contacts, with a hardened philosophy that would guide the rest of his life. Victims do not matter, only power does. The scam in Lviv was small. A few apartments, a few families, a few thousand rubles, but the lesson was permanent. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union began its final, chaotic collapse. As the empire crumbled, Mogilevich saw his moment. He left Ukraine and relocated to Budapest, Hungary. Budapest in those years was something extraordinary, a neutral crossroads between East and West. The Iron Curtain had holes here. Intelligence agencies from every major power maintained stations. Arms dealers negotiated deals in cafes. Criminal organizations from Russia, Ukraine, Chechnya, and beyond all converged in the chaos. It was a city without rules, where a man with ambition and no conscience could build anything. And Mogilevich built everything. He constructed his own syndicate from scratch, one that would operate on a completely different level than the street gangs and extortion rackets that define traditional organized crime. He had a vision, a multinational corporation of crime, with divisions for every illegal enterprise, with bankers and enforcers and logistics specialists, with no single leader who could be decapitated. His recruitment strategy was brilliant and terrifying. He did not hire street thugs. He hired professionals, ex-KGB officers, suddenly unemployed as their agency dissolved. Afghanistan war veterans, trained in violence and psychologically damaged by what they had seen and done. Men who had tortured prisoners in Kabul and felt nothing. Men who had killed dozens and slept soundly. These were not bodyguards. They were killers with military training who would not flinch at any order. A former mob insider named Leonid Ryitman, who later testified to the FBI about Mogilevich's tactics, described his approach. First the leaders, then the new leaders who replaced them, until the whole group was gone. Mogilevich did not cut off the head of a rival organization. He burned the roots. He destroyed everyone. If a competing gang refused to submit, he would kill the boss. Then he would kill the underboss who stepped up. Then he would kill the captain who took over after that. He kept killing until the organization simply ceased to exist, either because its members were dead or because they had fled to other countries. Competitors who refused to submit simply vanished. Bodies surfaced in the Danube with disturbing regularity. River became a graveyard for men who crossed Semyon Mogilevich. By the mid-1990s, he was not just a boss. He was the boss of bosses. A criminal who operated with impunity across a dozen countries, while law enforcement in each one blamed another jurisdiction. But running street rackets was only the beginning. What happens when a man with unlimited violence and unlimited ambition decides to go corporate? Mogilevich's portfolio expanded with terrifying speed. Weapons trafficking. His network supplied everything from Kalashnikovs to surface to air missiles. Western intelligence services tracked shipments to African warlords and Middle Eastern militias. There were persistent whispers, never fully confirmed but never fully dismissed, of deals involving nuclear materials from poorly guarded Soviet stockpiles. Uranium, plutonium, the kind of materials that keep intelligence agencies awake at night. Drug trafficking. He controlled heroin routes stretching from the poppy fields of Afghanistan through Turkey to the streets of Western Europe. A pipeline worth billions annually. His organization could move product across borders that stopped legitimate commerce. His chemists cut and packaged heroin in Hungarian farmhouses. His couriers flew first class with suitcases lined with product. Human trafficking. His syndicate ran brothels across the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Israel. They moved women from impoverished villages in Ukraine and Moldova, promising them jobs as waitresses or nannies in Western Europe. When the women arrived, they found themselves prisoners, their passports confiscated, their bodies for sale. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who tried to escape were killed. Those who cooperated were moved from city to city, never staying long enough to form connections, always under guard. Money laundering. His financial advisors, some with advanced degrees from Moscow's best universities, created Byzantine webs of shell companies to wash dirty money clean. Money flowed through bank accounts stretching from Cyprus to Gibraltar to the Channel Islands. It moved through real estate purchases in London, through art auctions in Geneva, through legitimate businesses that existed only on paper. By the time the money emerged, it was indistinguishable from legitimate revenue. Every new venture added a layer of armor. His wealth ballooned into the billions, making it easy to buy friends and influence. He accumulated at least a dozen known aliases and multiple citizenships. One day he was Semyon Mogilevich Talish. The next he was Sergei Schneider. Hungarian one week, Israeli the next. He collected passports like other people collect stamps. He moved freely across borders, living in mansions in Budapest and dachas outside Moscow. No single police force could track all his movements. No single charge in one country could stop a man who could vanish into another. This was the man behind that empty magnet factory in Pennsylvania. A man whose power transcended the underworld and started to rival legitimate states. The FBI's 45-count indictment now felt like trying to lasso a tornado. Here is where natural gas enters the story. By the 2000s, Mogilevich had insinuated himself into Eastern Europe's most strategic industry, energy. Through proxies and front companies, he became a hidden player behind a Swiss-registered firm called Rose-Ucker Energo. This company was the middleman for Russia's natural gas exports to Ukraine and through Ukraine to the rest of Europe. To understand why this matters, you must understand natural gas in Europe. Russia's gas feeds furnaces and power plants across the continent. When winter comes and temperatures drop below freezing, that gas is not a luxury, it is survival. Control the gas flow, and you have a chokehold on nations. A phone call can turn off the heat in millions of homes. A pipeline shutdown can freeze entire cities. Mogilevich did not need to be a politician or a general to wield this power. He just needed to control a company that everyone relied on but few understood. Rose-Ucker Energo became a massive player in European energy. It handled enormous volumes of gas. It generated enormous profits. And behind the scenes, Mogilevich was a silent partner, taking his cut, building his influence, making himself indispensable. Years later, a U.S. diplomatic cable would reveal a stunning detail. Dmitry Firtash, the Ukrainian oligarch nominally running Rose-Ucker Energo, admitted privately that he needed Mogilevich's approval to operate. The mob boss was literally a gatekeeper in the energy sector. He had to sign off on major decisions. He had to be consulted on important moves. He was not just a silent partner taking money, he was an active participant controlling strategy. What kind of criminal makes himself essential to a superpower's foreign policy? What kind of gangster becomes a player in international energy markets? The kind who becomes untouchable. By 2009, the FBI had exhausted conventional options. They had the indictment. They had the evidence. They had witnesses willing to testify. What they did not have was Mogilevich. Standard law enforcement playbooks would not work. They needed the cooperation of foreign governments. They needed him to slip up and travel somewhere within reach. They needed a miracle. So they reached for their biggest lever, international exposure. October 21, 2009. FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. In a wood-paneled conference room, officials finalized a decision that would echo across international law enforcement. The 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list was about to get a new name, one that few Americans could pronounce and fewer had ever heard of. Since J. Edgar Hoover created the list in 1950, it had maintained a 94% capture rate. 463 of 523 people listed had been apprehended or located. The list works because it turns every customs agent, every airline employee, every citizen with a television into a potential informant. When a fugitive goes up on that rogues gallery, the world takes notice. Borders become harder to cross. Airlines flag passports. Tips flood in from every continent. The heat becomes inescapable. Semyon Mogilevich's mugshot joined the ranks of notorious outlaws. His balding head and heavy jowls positioned alongside Osama bin Laden's gaunt face on the roster of America's Most Wanted. The Bureau publicized the $100,000 reward on his head, later raised to $5 million. Press releases emphasized just how dangerous this man was. International con artist, boss of bosses of an Eastern European Mafia super network, threat to the global financial system. In law enforcement terms, this was the nuclear option. They were pulling every diplomatic string, activating every partner agency from Interpol to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, deploying every trick in the book to smoke him out. At first, there appeared to be a breakthrough. January 2008. A year and a half before the top 10 listing, something remarkable happened. Mogilevich was unexpectedly arrested in Moscow by Russian police at an upscale restaurant. The charge seemed almost comically minor: tax evasion at a chain of cosmetic stores he owned. Not weapons trafficking, not murder, not fraud, tax evasion on perfume sales. But there he was, in handcuffs, in custody, on Russian soil. The FBI's hopes surged. Could this be the opening they needed? Would Russia actually cooperate? Perhaps in exchange for some diplomatic concession. Perhaps as a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps the years of pressure, the Interpol red notices, the diplomatic cables were finally working. Agents in Philadelphia and Washington knew it was a long shot. Russia had never shown any interest in helping America prosecute Mogilevich. But the mere fact that he was behind bars in a Moscow detention center was encouraging. Maybe the pressure was working. 18 months later, those hopes were brutally, savagely dashed. July 2009. A Moscow court quietly ordered Mogilevich released from jail. The official reason bordered on absurd. A Russian Interior Ministry spokeswoman explained that the charges were not of a particularly grave nature. So investigators had no particular reason to keep him imprisoned. Not grave. The man the FBI suspects of trafficking guns, drugs, humans, and possibly nuclear material. The man whose fraud robbed North Americans of $150 million. The man who has ordered killings across Europe. Released because Russian authorities classified his case as no big deal. Mogilevich posted bail and walked out the door, free. The FBI realized something terrifying in that moment. Mogilevich was not just hiding in Russia, he was being sheltered, protected. The top 10 listing, the publicity, the reward, none of it made a dent. Moscow either did not get the memo or did not care. The very next month, as the FBI was adding him to the most wanted list with great fanfare, Mogilevich was reportedly settling back into life in Moscow, dining at upscale restaurants as if nothing had happened. International pressure was supposed to make him persona non grata. Instead, it barely ruffled his feathers. Inside the FBI, frustration gave way to cold realization. The usual formula, making the world too hot for the fugitive to hide, was not working. Mogilevich's name on a wanted poster did not scare a government that willingly set him free. Why would Russia protect a mob boss? Why thumb its nose at a U.S. indictment and an Interpol red notice for this man? The answer has nothing to do with lack of evidence or lack of effort. It has everything to do with power. To understand the invisible barrier the FBI keeps slamming against, consider the timing of Mogilevich's rise. He built his empire in the 1990s, the wildest and most lawless decade in modern Russian history. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. State assets worth hundreds of billions were being privatized, often to whoever had the cash or the connections to grab them. Organized crime groups and former KGB officers were indistinguishable in many cases. The lines between government, business, and criminal enterprise simply ceased to exist. And in St. Petersburg, a mid-level ex-KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was serving as deputy mayor. He was cutting deals with businessmen of questionable background. He was getting a crash course in how organized crime could intertwine with politics, commerce, and state power. Putin's later rise would be built partly on mastering that gray zone, on understanding that in the new Russia, the Mafia and the state were not enemies but partners. Mogilevich, with his immense wealth, his international banking networks, and his ability to move money and goods across any border without attracting attention, was exactly the kind of figure who could prove useful to ambitious men in that world. He was not a patriot. He was not an ideologue. He was a tool, a very expensive, very effective tool that could be deployed when the state needed things done that the state could never officially do. Years later, curious evidence of that utility emerged. In 1999, a Ukrainian presidential bodyguard named Mykola Melnichenko began making secret recordings of President Leonid Kuchma's private conversations. The tapes, later authenticated by U.S. intelligence, captured hundreds of hours of candid discussions. In one leaked snippet, a voice identified as Kuchma casually mentioned that Mogilevich had a good relationship with Putin. The implication was clear. This was not street gossip. This was coming from a head of state who would know. Around the same time, ex-FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko, who had defected to Britain and was cooperating with British intelligence, made claims that Mogilevich had been an informant and asset for the KGB since the 1980s, continuing his relationship with its successor agency, the FSB. Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210 in London in November 2006. He died a slow, agonizing death in a British hospital, his body irradiated from within. The murder was almost certainly ordered by the Kremlin, and it lent grim credibility to his accusations. Ukrainian intelligence chief Ihor Smeshko independently reported to U.S. officials that Mogilevich enjoyed protection at the highest levels in Moscow, effectively operating as an instrument of Russian security services when needed. Mogilevich was not just a mafia boss doing his own thing. He was entwined with the Russian state, a resource, an asset, a tool. By the 2000s, as Putin consolidated power and became Russia's president, Mogilevich moved openly about Moscow. He bought a lavish dacha in an elite suburb. He dined at high-end restaurants. He appeared to fear no Russian law enforcement because there was nothing to fear. If he had been a valuable resource to Russian intelligence, someone who could facilitate the laundering of billions through offshore accounts, or broker illicit arms deals the Kremlin wanted deniability on, or manage that critical gas trade, then turning him over to the Americans would be out of the question. The gas angle exemplifies how Mogilevich made himself untouchable by making himself useful. Through Rose-Ukrenergo, he had indirect control over a significant slice of Russia's energy exports. That gave him leverage not just over gangsters or businessmen, but over governments. The Kremlin could use Rose-Ukrenergo as a lever in negotiations with Ukraine, and Mogilevich's cut kept him rich and loyal. A U.S. diplomatic cable later revealed that the Ukrainian oligarch nominally running Rose-Ukrenergo admitted privately that he needed Mogilevich's approval to operate. Mogilevich was literally a gatekeeper in the energy sector. In Putin's Russia, if you help the state project power or make money, and ideally do both, you become part of the club. Mogilevich delivered on both counts. Picture the scene from the perspective of an FBI agent in 2010 trying to strategize the capture of Semyon Mogilevich. Extradition treaty with Russia? None. Russia's constitution forbids handing over its citizens, and Mogilevich now holds Russian citizenship. The treaty, such as it exists, is a dead letter. Secret snatch operation on foreign soil, that would be an act of war if attempted in Moscow. The FBI does not conduct military invasions. It does not send commandos into sovereign nations to kidnap people. That is what the CIA does, and even the CIA would not attempt it in the heart of the Russian capital. Lure him out. They tried that with the most wanted list, hoping he would slip up and travel to a country that would extradite him. He did not. He stayed in Moscow, comfortable, protected, untouchable. The man has not left Russia in years. Why would he? He has everything he needs. Interpol notice. Just a piece of paper to a man who sits under the Kremlin's umbrella. Agents in the Philadelphia field office, who had devoted years of their careers to this case, watched helplessly as their target faded into the Moscow elite. They read intelligence reports describing his movements around the city. They saw photographs of him at restaurants. They knew exactly where he was, and they could do nothing. Special Agent Peter Cohenhoven, who worked the case for years, later expressed the frustration. We knew where he was, we knew what he was doing, and we couldn't touch him. The FBI kept Mogilevich on the top 10 list for 6 years, hoping against hope. They chased down rumors and whisperings, a sighting in a Moscow cafe, an unconfirmed trip to Hungary, a possible visit to Cyprus. But nothing panned out. Every lead died at the Russian border. Mogilevich was not like other fugitives who stay on the list for decades while hiding in a jungle or a mountain. He was hiding in plain sight, under the protection of a major world power. Barring a sudden regime change in Moscow or a one-in-a-million deal, there would be no perp walk. By 2015, the FBI's leadership faced a grim choice. Leave Mogilevich on the top 10 list indefinitely as a symbolic gesture, knowing they cannot touch him. Or make a rare and painful exception, acknowledging publicly that this is one fugitive they simply cannot capture. December 2015. A brief press statement crosses the wire services, largely unnoticed amid the holiday bustle of shopping reports and year-end retrospectives. The FBI announces it is removing Semyon Mogilevich from the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. The wording is dry, almost bureaucratic. Mogilevich is known to be residing in a country that does not extradite to the United States, and he no longer poses an immediate threat to the American public. No fanfare, no press conference, just a quiet deletion and a handful of paragraphs explaining the obvious. Everyone who has been paying attention understands the subtext. The most powerful law enforcement agency on Earth has conceded defeat in the face of immutable geopolitical reality. Mogilevich becomes only the 7th person in 65 years to be removed from the top 10 list without being captured or killed. The FBI spent years and millions of dollars on this case. They proved the crimes. The 45-count indictment still stands, sealed in a filing cabinet in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, gathering dust. They know exactly who Semyon Mogilevich is and what he has done. He defrauded investors of their retirement savings. He ordered the deaths of rivals. He trafficked women from Ukrainian villages to brothels in Tel Aviv. He brokered arms deals to warlords in Africa. He built an empire on human suffering. They did everything by the book to bring him to justice. None of it mattered because the book has a last page. American jurisdiction stops at the borders of a sovereign state that refuses to play along, and Russia will never play along. The FBI's addendum that they do not believe Mogilevich poses an immediate threat to the American public rings hollow. It is a face-saving formulation, a way of saying he is not actively defrauding Americans on American soil at this particular moment. It does not mean he is harmless. It does not mean justice has been served. It means they have given up. The man himself, nearly 70 by then, was living comfortably in Moscow's wealthiest suburbs. A free man. He has never spent a single day in U.S. custody, never seen the inside of an American courtroom, never answered for the devastation of YBM's collapse or any of his other alleged crimes. The investors who lost everything got no justice. The civil settlements from the YBM case, after years of litigation, recovered perhaps 15 cents on the dollar for victims. Retired teachers who had invested their pensions received pennies for every dollar they lost. Elderly couples who had bet their retirement on a fairy tale got nothing meaningful. The witnesses who bravely came forward to testify against one of the world's most dangerous mafia bosses did so at immense personal risk. Some entered witness protection, leaving behind their homes, their friends, their identities. Some fled their home countries, never to return. Their testimony, given at great cost, led nowhere. FBI agents like Mike Dixon and Peter Cohenhoven, who devoted the prime years of their careers to this case, retired with that one name still nagging at them. The one that got away. The case that consumed years of their lives and ended in defeat. Leonid Rietman, the mob insider who risked everything to testify, lives in hiding, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if Mogilevich's reach might one day find him. The women trafficked from Ukrainian villages, the families whose loved ones vanished into the Danube, the rivals who refused to submit and paid with their lives, none of them saw justice. The man responsible sits in a Moscow suburb, untroubled and untouchable. Semyon Mogilevich celebrates his 79th birthday this year, likely with family, likely with fine champagne, perhaps at an opulent villa outside Moscow, surrounded by guards and luxury. A free man with blood on his hands and money in the bank. The FBI's white whale swims on in waters where they cannot follow. He has outlived rivals. He has outlasted investigations. He has outsmarted the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. His story is not one of justice prevailing, but of power protecting power. Russian authorities occasionally issue statements denying his importance. They claim he is a minor figure, a small-time con artist, not worth America's attention. But their actions betray their words. If he were truly minor, they would hand him over. The fact that they protect him proves his value. In the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the indictment remains active. If Mogilevich ever sets foot in a country that will extradite to the United States, he will be arrested. But at 79, with unlimited money and unlimited protection, he has no reason to take that risk. He will likely die in Russia, surrounded by luxury, never facing the consequences of his crimes. The victims will die without closure. The agents will retire without their collar. The case will be filed away in archives, a reminder that sometimes the bad guys win. The FBI's capitulation is not just about Mogilevich. It is a stark admission that there is a limit to what justice can reach when faced with certain realities. It is easy to believe that no one is beyond the law. That given enough time and effort, even the worst criminals will be brought to heel. The story of Semyon Mogilevich forces us to confront a far more uncomfortable truth. Above a certain threshold of wealth, power, and political protection, the law is not absolute. There are people in this world who have made themselves so valuable to those in power that the rules simply stop applying to them. They operate in a space beyond justice, beyond accountability, beyond reach. Mogilevich found that threshold, he exploited it. He built an empire on the understanding that if you become useful enough to the right people, nothing can touch you. He is living proof that sometimes justice for all comes with an asterisk. An asterisk that reads, except for those who know the right people. Except for those who make themselves indispensable. Except for those who understand that power, not law, is the ultimate currency. He is still out there. And his story forces one unsettling question. If one man can place himself above the law by making himself useful to a superpower, how many others might be doing the same right now? How many Mogileviches operate in the shadows, protected by governments that should be hunting them? How many crimes will never be answered for because the criminals found the right protectors? You might remember El Chapo, another figure who seemed untouchable for decades. The Mexican government hunted him, captured him, lost him, captured him again. He escaped from maximum security prisons through tunnels dug to his cell. He seemed invincible. The difference, Mexico eventually broke. The government changed. The political calculus shifted. El Chapo was extradited and now rots in a Colorado supermax, serving life without parole. Russia will never break. The political calculus will never shift. Mogilevich will never be extradited. And that difference is the reason Semyon Mogilevich remains free, while El Chapo spends 23 hours a day in a 7 by 10-foot cell. So where is he now? The best intelligence suggests Mogilevich continues to live in the Moscow region, moving between a luxurious dacha in the elite suburb of Zhukovka and apartments in the city center. He is old now, slowed by age, but still wealthy, still protected, still untouchable. His network continues to operate, though perhaps with less direct involvement from its aging founder. The businesses he built, the legitimate fronts, the criminal enterprises, the energy interests continue to generate wealth. The people who protect him continue to protect him. The system that sheltered him continues to shelter him. In Washington, the case grows cold. New agents assigned to the Philadelphia field office learn about Mogilevich in training as a historical curiosity. This is the one that got away, they are told. This is the case we couldn't close. Then they move on to active investigations. In Moscow, an old man wakes each morning to servants and security, to breakfast on a terrace overlooking manicured gardens, to a life of comfort paid for by decades of crime. He reads the news, perhaps sees references to himself in Western publications, smiles at the frustration he knows he causes. He won. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Not that justice is always delayed but eventually arrives. Not that the good guys always win in the end, but that sometimes, if you play the game well enough, if you align yourself with the right powers, if you become valuable enough to those who hold ultimate authority, you can beat the system. Semyon Mogilevich beat the system. He beat the FBI, he beat Interpol. He beat the United States government.